Hi, my name is Nick Franklin, the founder and CEO of ChartMogul. And this week we are in Tokyo, Japan to find out about the current state of the SaaS industry here in Tokyo. So we're going to be visiting some offices and interviewing SaaS founders, and we're going to be attending some tech events and, just getting a sense for how the local software as a service industry has evolved in Japan and specifically in Tokyo over the last 10 years. I've been to Tokyo a whole bunch of times, but not for a while. Actually, around 13 years ago, 2012, 2013, I had a job where I was helping Zendesk set up their Tokyo office. And I visited Tokyo a whole bunch of times, around that time. And back then, SaaS was pretty new to Japan. There weren't a whole lot of domestic SaaS companies, or the big American companies like Salesforce had just got set up. And now Salesforce, I can see 12 years later, Salesforce is huge here, like somewhere just over there, they have like a huge Salesforce Tokyo office, and Zendesk big and successful here, and I can see other players like Stripe and Notion have moved in. But far more interesting to me is how many local domestic Japanese SaaS companies are there? What's the state of the SMB Japanese SaaS market? And with those companies, what kind of markets are they addressing? What kind of problems are they solving? Are they really just addressing the Japanese market, or are they going international as well? And also for ChartMogul, we have some revenue from Japan and some customers, but it's 1% to 2% of global revenue. And Japan is a massive high-tech economy. I'm really interested to find out if we should be investing more here. And it's going to be an exciting week. How have you found the current environment here in Japan? Obviously, SaaS has been experiencing a little bit of a recession the last couple of years in the US and Europe. I'm just curious if that's happening here in Japan.
First of all, I think the underlying drivers of the market in Japan are really, really different to the West. We're quite far behind. And so anytime I'm talking to anybody from the West or who doesn't know the market, you got to dial your head back 10 years. And just in terms of where the market is, at least, depending on the segment of the economy. So I don't think that we've really felt the same pressures that we have in the West. I mean, interest rates are still super low. Digital adoption super, super low. Worker efficiency is low. So we're still very much in the early innings of SaaS.
That's really interesting.
Adoption here, yeah.
That's really interesting that you say they're far behind, because Japan is often seen, and for me visiting here, it's a lot of things are very high tech.
Right.
But perhaps what you mean, maybe in software, especially in enterprise software, that's just not the case, right?
I'd say enterprise software, kind of digital adoption in general, and even just how work gets done. So I guess the analogy we all use is the hardware is from 2050, but the software is maybe from 1995.
I get it.
やっぱり日本の今の SaaS の市況が非常に厳しい状況にも追いやられているかなと思ってます。今の上場している日本の SaaS の銘柄も非常にバリエーションが下がっているという中になりますので、我々のようなスタートアップ、未上場スタートアップもやはりこのベンチャーキャピタルもしくは投資家からの出資が得られにくい状況には今なっているので、結構投資したくてもしづらい状況っていうのは正直言うと今の状況かなと思ってます。
Actually, 10 years ago it was not, but today, all enterprises are shifting, cloud and SaaS. And actually, one of our investor called All Star SaaS Fund is focusing on SaaS startups. They are very original VC focusing on the SaaS. A few of their portfolio companies became unicorn. One of that is Smart HR. So such kind of tools are booming. Also, Salesforce is one of the most popular SFA tool in Japan.
There's a bunch of businesses that have bubbled up over the years. I think the obvious successes, SaaS or not, but tech companies would be, your Mercardis, your Smart Newses of the world. They're already big, mega startups at this stage. But if you're looking at even just the last maybe 5 years, companies like Josys have come out of nowhere. They're building globally. They've got a big tech team in India. They're selling in the US.
Wow.
Really, really hot startup. Same co-founder, another business called Roxel. They built a SaaS platform targeting SMBs in Japan, one of the fastest growing startups here. They're amazing at refinement. They're amazing at materials engineering, mechanical engineering, but just historically, the Japanese economy hasn't really birthed a lot of innovation in the digital space in terms of software, etc.
With these SaaS companies, are they mostly serving the domestic Japanese market? What percentage of them do you think are kind of going international from day one or early on versus?
99% focus on domestic market.
99% domestic market. Japan is a huge economy.
Right. There's language difference, cultural difference. Foreign companies don't understand the ecosystem, but we have competitive, understand the culture and language. Most of SaaS companies started developing the product in Japanese, not in English. So that is a big difference.
Japan is in a Goldilocks zone in a bad way. So what I mean by that is that it's big enough to become a quite like fairly successful founders by just doing domestic startup in Japan, because it's still like maybe like fourth largest economy in the world, and you can be rich by just doing Japan-based business, but it's not big enough to be successful internationally. If you think about the US market, or even like India or Europe, if you are a number one service provider in the market in the US, it'll naturally mean you are number one in global. Whereas, even if you're like number one in Japan, it doesn't necessarily mean you have a sort of, advantage for the global market.
基本的にはやっぱり方針としてはどこもまず国内で市場を取りに行くというところが、メインになる企業がスタートアップが多いかなって印象は受けてます。我々もそうですね、IPO を目指していく中でもう本当に今年来年でですね、グローバルの可能性、国内外の市場へのトライっていうところをもう開始していきたいなというふうには思ってます。
The vast majority of startups here are still focused on domestic issues, and for right and for wrong, the market's quite large, right?
Of course, it's a huge economy.
It's a target-rich environment. It's a giant economy. They're very, very far behind. So I would still say the vast majority are building for Japan. And then after they try to figure out how to take it globally, but a lot of times it's quite challenging because you get boxed into this market.
If you pick one segment of a software market, let's say you have 3 companies that are trying to get into that market in Japan, and if you look at the US, there are like 30 or maybe like 300 companies competing within that market, which makes them like focus more to a specific niche within the market, and also the customer expects that to happen. So the offering needs to be very precise, very targeted to a specific subgroup of the market. That's the biggest difference. You cannot just take the Japanese product and expect to sell in the US market. A lot of companies are trying to build international presence so that they can at least diversify their revenue stream, not just relying on the shrinking economy of Japan, but tapping into the growth of the international market.
If you're selling business application software in Japan, especially in the enterprise like we are, and day one, we wanted to go after, the big opportunities that we saw. It's very sales-led, it's very relationship-driven still. That's going to be something just culturally that's difficult to remove. We're not selling infrastructure, we're not selling some form of like core cybersecurity, it's business application software. So in that sense, it's very sales-driven, it's very labor-intensive. Hence, we wanted to augment the business model with consulting to, in a way, monetize the long sales cycles on the SaaS side.
The typical textbook go-to-market in the US is to go after really specific niche, really go deep, and then try to expand to the adjacent segments.
Yeah.
Start from yoga studio and then try to expand to the gym as a whole, for example. There aren't enough yoga studios in Japan, period, end of story. So you have to be kind of broad.
Ecosystem is a little bit different from in other countries, I think, is, as you said, products are sold by, sales and relationship. That is one thing. And also, Japanese enterprises are working with IT companies, system integrator, MSSP, and such kind of consulting firm is managing digital related, thing. Everything, actually, Many of the enterprise company don't have IT professional team. So that is the problem, actually. Yeah, that's why if SaaS companies from abroad, they must have the local partners.
I think the key factor in Japan is usually high quality. Especially in business setting, most customers seems to look for systems that have a relatively highest bar than most of what I could experience in the rest of the world. So I developed for Europe, I developed for North America. I didn't run into the same blockers or expectation in those markets that I had encountered in Japan. What can make or break a customer expectation and success of a product is actual quality of the software itself. So you can have a limited set of features if they are really fitting the need of your customer, but if those do not meet the expectation of the customer directly from their own high quality grade, I think that is a big blocker, at least from my experience.
There's a difference in the customer's mindset where Japanese decision makers tend to appreciate checking off many boxes. You have to be easy to use, you have to be secure, you have to have many logos and case studies and testimonials, you have to be good at support, yada yada. They tend to be more broad in terms of the requirement as well.
One thing you do see is maybe changing established processes could be a little bit slower and more conservative, meaning you have to convince the customer to actually make a change. And if you have to convince them to make too many changes to their established process, that could slow down your sales here. So it's a balance. If you're trying to sell a SaaS product to a Japanese customer, you don't just want to convince them that your product is great. You also have to convince them that it won't change their existing practices too much as well. And that's the balance you have to have on both the product side and the sales side to kind of convince them to spend money on this new software or this new product.
の広告を使ったりとか、あとはちょっと泥臭いんですけれども、オフラインで、そのターゲットがいる場所に出向いて、名刺交換をして、でそこから自社リストに加えて、ナチャリングをしていくと、マーケティングっていくっていうような形で、結構泥臭くやって、最後クロージングは営業を介入するというところにはなってますので、今後はやっぱりとはいえですね、営業を介入しないと売れないっていうプロダクトっていうのは、なかなかスケーラビリティが低くなってくるとは思ってますので、我々も今の商材だけじゃなくてですね、まずきっかけとして、プロダクトを先行型で売れるようなビジネスモデルっていうのは考えていかないと生き残れないかなとは思ってます。
For anybody who's even considering looking at the Japanese market, you got to come in with a war chest of cash, a ton of patience, and you need to figure out how to kind of unlock relationships because it's very difficult to do it product-led. Although I do agree, we're moving AI and agentic and things are fundamentally shifting. When it comes to Japan, I think there's a couple things. One, you kind of have your first generation of tools that are maturing and frankly quite antiquated. And that's where you're seeing private equity coming in and buying up relatively scaled up businesses, but are probably suboptimal in terms of performance. I expect a lot of private equity. We expect a ton of investment to go into early stage startups that are attacking both some traditional SaaS products. Arguably ours is still to a degree, but also some of the more agentic AI plays, especially tackling labor shortages in Japan. So you're going to see, in a way, almost a bifurcated market between the mega enterprise can only move at the speed at which they can move. And regardless of what technology can feasibly do, they're not going to be jumping all over the bandwagon of AI because they've got too much to lose, right? So I think you're going to see almost an economic bottom up on the AI play with SMBs and maybe mid-market adopting it more quickly than you're going to see in the enterprise. And on the enterprise side, there's still so much room to go that at least from where we stand and everybody we know and the way we see the market, there's at least 7 to 10 years of just solid structural growth to be seen here, both from next generation products displacing kind of first gen products, but also entire new categories that haven't even really been adopted at mass yet in this market. So from our perspective, Japan is all tides are rising, assuming
that's fantastic.
It doesn't fall apart. So
the golden years of SaaS are just getting started here in Tokyo.
Welcome to 2008, right?
That's also, yeah, that's awesome. That's fantastic.
The foreign entrepreneurs in Japan, I think I can see the increase of, foreigners that are starting companies in Japan, mainly because of lower competition as well as, better access to relatively cheap software talent, as well as obviously, good quality of life.
You will, have a lot of candidates knocking at your door. Another benefit of actually being in Japan is that there's a lot of what you would call fringe benefits of working in Japan that I think founders need to showcase when they're looking for talent and speaking of those talents. So for instance, Japanese salaries may be lower compared to, the global standards, but you have things such as the healthcare system is not only socialized, but actually quite free and fluid. So, getting healthcare and, keeping healthy. There's also a lot of, government and societal programs to help, for instance, foreigners or people who are trying to start new businesses or people who are trying to start new ways of working. There's a lot of opportunity because the supply is here, but the demand is low. So if you get in now, I think you'll be ahead of the curve.
In Japan, they say the black ship, which is the metaphor for the Commodore Perry coming in and opening Japan to the west is the black ship sailing into Yokohama Bay and saying,
right, okay.
The black ship on this one that really opened up the SaaS market was Corona. Suddenly, everybody got sent home and nobody was set up to work remote. Nobody was equipped to deal with this. And so objectively, in the last 3 to 4 years, you have seen an explosion in kind of SaaS testing and adoption and opportunity, but we're nowhere near like adoption rates where we are in the West. I mean, depending on who you talk to and what you look at, we could be at anywhere of less than 10% of the same adoption rate of similar sized organizations.
Right.
Apples to apples.
So tons of opportunity, but patience required for sure. So I'm now back from my very short trip to Tokyo. I did learn a few things about the current state of the Japanese SaaS industry. The first thing that struck me is just how much bigger it is than 12, 13 years ago when I was helping Zendesk get set up. I mean, this time I just had no trouble getting introductions to a whole bunch of really cool SaaS companies, the founders, executives. That just didn't exist when we were setting up Zendesk in 2012, 2013 in Tokyo. The list of Japanese companies doing SaaS was extremely small. The other thing that really struck me is just how diverse the Japanese SaaS ecosystem is. So, especially Japan doesn't have a reputation of being a particularly diverse country. It's pretty Japanese. But the startup and SaaS industry is really diverse. It felt more like Berlin. In Berlin, where ChartMogul got started and has an office, there's a ton of German founders, but there's also founders from all over the world, from the United States, from Canada, from Australia, from all over Europe. It seems like Tokyo has a similar kind of vibe happening. It has a whole bunch of international founders, who go there because it's got lower costs, especially with the weakened Japanese yen, to start their company than traditional, maybe New York or San Francisco or London. It's lower cost. It's got a great lifestyle, lots to do in Tokyo, and also some incentives for starting a company, and also a really good visa system where it's easy to bring the people that you want to Japan to work for your startup. It had that similar sort of vibe, which I wasn't expecting. And it seems like these internationally focused SaaS startups in Tokyo, they seem to all be focusing a bit on the Japanese market. You have this huge economy right on your doorstep. You might as well sell into it. But they were also kind of going international earlier. And, when I visited those websites, companies like Zookeep, it defaulted me to English language, whereas the startups that were started by Japanese founders, they were often much more focused on the Japanese market. One founder told me, 99% of Japanese founders, they just focus on the Japanese market. And, those websites were mostly in Japanese and they were much more domestically focused, which is, good and bad. I mean, Japan is a very big country, so you can build a really substantial business just serving the Japanese market. What you can't do, however, is build a, really truly global sort of SaaS giant along the lines of Notion or Figma or Salesforce or Zendesk, etc. So perhaps that's partly why we haven't seen, many huge global Japanese SaaS companies getting built, because so many of them are just focused on Japan. One thing I heard a few times from SaaS founders is how COVID was a huge kind of trigger for shifting everyone's mindset in corporate Japan towards needing to adopt SaaS, because suddenly 5 years ago everyone had to work from home, and it was very clear that corporate Japan was just not set up for working remotely, working from home, and therefore this kind of led to this huge shift in mindset where everyone had to start thinking seriously about migrating towards cloud software versus on-premise solutions. So it feels also like, there hasn't been any slowdown in SaaS as we've seen in the West. Like the uptake of SaaS since the last 3 years, since the end of the zero interest rate policy, SaaS growth rates have really slowed down in the US and Europe the last 2 or 3 years, unfortunately. But in Japan, that seems to not be the case. No one mentioned that. In fact, people said that things are actually kind of accelerating and that we're much earlier on the adoption curve in Japan for SaaS. So it feels like maybe the start of sort of the golden era of SaaS in Japan really underway right now. And it's a great time to be running a SaaS business focused on the Japanese market currently. So the other thing that was interesting to me, the style of doing business, is it still very relationship driven, sales driven, or are there, product-led growth companies out there? Now, most people mentioned that, it's still quite relationship driven. In Japan, you have to build a relationship, and less just kind of transactional product-led approach to sales. Luckily Tokyo, it's, everything's in one city almost in Japan. If you live there, you can kind of build that network. Sales-led is kind of possible, whereas, if you're in Europe or the US, very spread out your market. To summarize, what were the interesting things? Much, much more robust, much more larger and more diverse SaaS ecosystem than there was 12, 13 years ago. The other really interesting thing, lots of diversity felt more like Berlin, founders coming from all over the world to start their companies in Japan. I just wasn't expecting that. In the startup scene, really diverse, people coming from all over the world to start their companies. And also great visa system, apparently. You can bring the people you want. So it could be a great place for international founders on top of places like Berlin or London or San Francisco. Maybe Tokyo is also a place you could consider. Well, I hope you enjoyed this short video about the SaaS scene in Japan and Tokyo. I made the decision to make this video a little bit last minute, and I was kind of inspired by Kaya from Slidebean and his videos where he goes into different parts of the world and explores local startup ecosystems. So I was kind of inspired a little bit by Kaya from Slidebean. They have an amazing YouTube channel. You should check it out. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye now.